I don't know quite how we're going to do this when I was looking at the topics to be covered, and I thought, oh, okay, that's a lot of information to be covered, not only in the hour, but I think a real challenge for each of our speakers to cover in just 20 minutes, reflecting on, I guess a bit of the Australian Red Cross. We're celebrating our centenary and reflecting on the fact that the Australian Red Cross itself was born just 9 days after World War I. And looking at and trying to explore with our speakers, the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement's fundamental mandate, which is, of course, to alleviate human suffering during times of armed conflict, and to look at, I guess, what we've been doing in the last 100 years. And then looking at a bit of a case study around our work in relation to nuclear weapons, and then really looking at and exploring those major developments, as I said, in terms of the last 100 years. So without further from me, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Associate Professor Alison Duxbury from the University of Melbourne. Associate Professor Alison Duxbury is Associate Dean, JD, at the Melbourne Law School and an Associate Director of the Asia Pacific Centre for Military Law. She is also a member of the International Advisory Commission of the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, the Australian Red Cross International Humanitarian Law Committee, and the Board of Directors of the International Society for Military Law and the Law of War. So please join me in welcoming Alison. Thanks.
Thanks very much, everyone. And I'd like to start by saying thank you in particular to Phoebe Wynne-Pope for inviting me to speak at the 100th birthday of the Australian Red Cross. Now, this panel, as Chris has stated, is entitled Wars, Laws and the Australian Red Cross, 100 Years of Weapons and War. And my brief is to give you an overview of weapons developments and the regulation of weapons in the last 100 years in 20 minutes. Now, when Phoebe asked me whether I would be available to give this presentation, she also asked me whether or not I would be using a PowerPoint presentation. But I've decided on a somewhat older style prop for this particular presentation. This is the 1914 Field Service pocketbook that was carried by one of my grandfathers in World War I. This particular grandfather served in Gallipoli, Belgium and France. And so this pocketbook, which he carried with him, has been around the world and back again. But there is a story from this pocketbook. Now, it contains much useful information about army life, including methods to ensure the purity of water in camp and the correct formation when marching with the cavalry division. Yvette also noticed that it has a section on cooking and also the difference between boiling and stewing, which she promised to ask me about later on. Luckily, my mum's not here because she'd be perplexed if I knew the difference between those two things, but that's another matter altogether. But most importantly for our purposes, it contains a fairly lengthy section on international law. And it's a salutary reminder to the international lawyers and perhaps others in the audience that despite our tendency to refer to the 1949 Geneva Conventions adopted at the end of World War II as the most important documents in the law of armed conflict, they're certainly not the first documents, and in the area of weapons regulation, they are not the only documents, or indeed perhaps the most important. Now, I'm not going to refer to the actual text because the text is tiny. In fact, the idea that anyone would actually read this while actually on operations I find quite amazing. But no doubt my grandfather's eyesight was far better than mine. The 1914 pocketbook summarises the first Geneva Convention, the 1864 Geneva Convention on the wounded and sick in the armed forces in field, the 1868 St. Petersburg Declaration, and the 1899 and 1907 Hague Conventions. It also includes rather a prophetic statement of the definition of an armistice in international law. The pocketbook reminds us that some weapons were already banned at the beginning of World War I. Thus, the text of the St. Petersburg Declaration is included in full. In this declaration, which is included in the book, it states that states have bound themselves not to employ in the war any projectile of a weight below 400 grams, which is either explosive or charged with fulminating or inflammable substances. It also includes an article from the 9th Hague Convention of 1907, which states that the bombardment by naval forces of undefended ports, towns, villages, dwellings, or buildings is forbidden. These two very different provisions demonstrate the twin means of regulating weapons. The first being to regulate the weapon itself, in this case by prohibiting explosive or other types of inflammable projectiles. The second being to regulate the way in which the weapon is used. Now, while I'll be concentrating on the first aspect of weapons regulations, it's important to remember that international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, regulates the way in which weapons are used in a number of different ways. For example, the basic principle of distinction, which requires that parties to the conflict shall distinguish between civilians and combatants, and this principle of proportionality, that any targeting decision must balance the loss of civilian lives with direct military advantage, regulate the use of weapons, although not necessarily the weapon itself. Now, the 1907 treaty, which is mentioned in this pocketbook, was the result of an international conference which was held in The Hague, which aimed to adopt a code of war that the great powers would agree to. And it was followed another international conference which was convened by the Tsar of Russia in 1899. Now, the aim of this 1899 conference, according to the Tsar, in a letter he wrote to the diplomats in St. Petersburg at the time, was to examine the most effectual means of ensuring to all people an end to the progressive development of all armaments. This conference should be a happy presage to the century which is about to begin. Now, this letter appears to place humanitarian considerations at its centrepiece. However, the motives of the Tsar in convening the conference were questioned. Was it convened as a result of humanitarian objectives, or did the Tsar convene the conference to assist in overcoming Russia's military weakness by seeking to restrict the weapons that could be used by other great powers? Now, while I'll be concentrating on the humanitarian objectives or motives behind the regulation of weapons, it's important to remember that international agreements are the result of complex negotiations between states and inevitably represent a compromise between humanitarian aims and potentially other objectives of states. Now, since the Hague Conference in 1899, international humanitarian law has sought to regulate or prevent the employment of weapons which cause what is said to be superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. This prohibition, which was included in these early documents, was also repeated in the 1977 additional protocol to the Geneva Convention. And it's actually also found in the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court and is now designated as a war crime. However, we should also note that the provision in the Rome Statute which deals with the prohibition of weapons which cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering is not operational as yet because it requires states to agree on a list of such weapons in the statute. And to date, this has not occurred. Thus, the statute definitely employs, for example, poisoned or poisoned weapons, asphyxiating gases and liquids, and employing bullets which expand or flatten. It does not necessarily, however, prohibit more modern forms of weapons. And this prompted a Jordanian delegate at the 2010 review conference for the Rome Statute to note that he would find it hard to explain to anyone why bullets which expanded or flattened were prohibited, while nuclear weapons and laser guns were not. And I'm going to leave the discussion of nuclear weapons to the experts, that is Tillman and Phoebe, and I won't be discussing nuclear weapons today. Now, it is because of the difficulty of negotiating bans on weapons through the law of armed conflict that it's important to ensure that states consider the impact of weapons when they're thinking about developing them. And that is why the requirement in the 1977 additional protocol that states must determine whether the employment of a weapon would in fact be prohibited under international law is so important, because that particular provision really kicks in at the stage when states are thinking about developing the weapons. But the question still remains, where does the threshold lie between a weapon that is permitted and those that should be outlawed, according to the idea that they cause superfluous injury and unnecessary suffering? And certainly there's been a lot of work through the International Committee of the Red Cross on that issue. But after all, we might ask, why don't we consider that all weapons cause suffering? But this is still an issue that is being debated. Now, given the reaction of the international community to the use of chlorine gas in April 1915 outside Ypres, a place, incidentally, where this pocketbook also travelled with my grandfather, although somewhat later in the war, this weapon would certainly meet the threshold of unnecessary suffering. Both sides used gas in World War I, despite its problems, both from a humanitarian perspective, as well as its uncertain effectiveness as a weapon of war. Now, the use of chlorine gas in 1915 violated existing law at the time, which it prohibited, as I've said, the employment of asphyxiating gases. Now, of course, the terminology used in such a ban is important. The law at this time prevented the employment of such weapons, although it did not prevent the production or trade in these weapons. After World War I, there were further attempts to regulate weapons in the interwar period, including a treaty adopted in 1925, specifically designed to prohibit the use of various methods, including bacteriological methods of warfare. And in fact, and this statistics I think comes from Bob Matthew, who's here in the audience today, there have been more than 150 arms control agreements covering a wide range of weapons since 1899. Now, this number of agreements is really quite startling when you consider that arms control treaties, or those treaties which are designed to regulate weapons, are typically very difficult to negotiate because they require major military powers to forgo the use of a weapon. Now, in the modern era, attempts to ban or to limit the use of weapons have moved in a new direction, with attempts to ban the production of weapons and not only their use in armed conflicts. And so I want to start with attempts to ban chemical weapons, not least given that I began with World War I, and also the recent news coverage of alleged use of chemical weapons in Syria. Now, international law has banned the use of chemical weapons for many years, but this ban was not directed at the production or the possession of such weapons. And as history tells us, if we don't want the weapon to be used in a conflict, then we should prevent it being developed. Most recently, in September this year, the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, completed a fact-finding mission and found information, and I'm quoting for their report, constituting compelling confirmation that a toxic chemical was used systematically and repeatedly as a weapon in villages in northern Syria. The properties of the gas led the mission to conclude with a high degree of confidence that chlorine, either pure or in mixture, is the toxic chemical in question. As the Director General of the organisation noted 2 months ago, it is a tragic irony that 100 years after chlorine gas was first used in the battlefield, its misuse to kill and terrorise unarmed civilians has again raised its ugly head. The negotiation of the Chemical Weapons Convention took over 20 years when it was ultimately concluded in 1992. Unlike earlier efforts at banning chemical weapons, as I've said, this new convention aimed to eliminate an entire category of weapons of mass destruction by prohibiting the development, production, acquisition, stockpiling, retention, transfer, or use of chemical weapons. It has introduced a verification and inspection regime to ensure compliance by state parties. There are currently 180 state parties to the convention, and importantly, these include, for example, the United States and Russia, the chemical exporting states of Western Europe, and also some major developing countries as well. The Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which was established in The Hague to administer this convention, is responsible for a verification regime, and its role in implementing Syria's decision to eliminate stockpiles of chemical weapons has also very recently been in the news. Multiple countries have been involved in the mission to remove and destroy the stockpile of weapons, including the United States, Denmark, Italy, Norway and Finland. This demonstrates that cooperative efforts can be undertaken to ban and eliminate certain categories of weapons if there is enough will in the international community. Now, this is an aside. It's important that we recognise Australia's contribution to this process, and not least, and I'm going to embarrass him now, the contribution of one particular Australian who's been involved with the Australian Red Cross for a number of years. Bob Matthews, who's an eminent scientist, was recently recognised by the OPCW through the inaugural OPCW and the Hague Award, which was the outcome of the win of the OPCW of the 2013 Nobel Peace Prize. I just wanted to say congratulations to Bob. And also, if you have any questions about chemical weapons, he'll be the one who's answering them, not me. Okay. Another attempt to ban an entire category of weapons can be found in the Landmines Convention. Unlike other weapons of war, anti-personnel landmines are victim-activated, which means that they cannot discriminate between civilians and military personnel. The Ottawa Treaty, as it is called, is part of the international response to the humanitarian crisis caused by the proliferation of anti-personnel landmines. In addition to the devastating impact on individual lives, mines also have severe social and economic consequences, particularly for a country attempting to rebuild after an armed conflict. The presence of mines can leave large portions of the national territory unusable. Mined roads and railways make the movement of persons difficult, as well as the delivery of humanitarian aid. Because of this problem, in 1997, countries negotiated what is called the Ottawa Treaty, an international treaty comprehensively banning once more the development, production, stockpiling, transfer and use of anti-personnel landmines, and also requiring their destruction. The roles of the Red Crescent and Red Cross societies and the International Committee of the Red Cross are explicitly mentioned in the treaty as institutions that were central to the campaign to ban landmines and as entities that can provide assistance for the care and rehabilitation of mine victims. The importance of such a ban, as well as the regime for the destruction of landmines contained in this treaty, is particularly pertinent when we consider, for example, reports earlier this year that when there were devastating floods in the Balkans, there was a landmine warning because of the landslides that were occurring. And this was because of landmines that had been placed back in the early 1990s as a part of the conflict in that country. So they're very long-term impacts. In the last few years, discussions on weapons control has moved to developments in robotics. Once the subject of science fiction, remote-controlled aerial weapons systems are already in use. The use of drones, both within and outside armed conflict, has been discussed repeatedly in the press. From the perspective of international humanitarian law, the main concern is to ensure that the applicable law is not circumvented by the development of a technology that reduces or removes human involvement. Some commentators have suggested that the new technologies may have a beneficial impact, as they could save lives of civilians by making targeting decisions more precise. But the questions which arise in relation to these technologies are the same which arise in relation to other weapons and are based once more on the fundamental principles of international humanitarian law. Can armed robotic systems discriminate between combatants and civilians? For example, can they detect the difference between a civilian and someone wearing a uniform? Is there a clear line of accountability with a person to enforce compliance with the law? So the same issues, the same questions arise as we see in relation to other weapons. Now, as the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Anti-Personnel Landmines Convention demonstrate, it's important that we limit the production of certain categories of weapons. But for all our discussion of chemical weapons, weapons of mass destruction, and automated weapons systems, it's important to remember that the major weapons used in armed conflicts today are much the same as were used in 1914. The United Nations Office for the Disarmament Affairs writes that small arms and light weapons are the weapons of choice in civil wars, organised crime, gang warfare, and terrorist attacks. That's why it's so important that in 2013 an arms trade treaty was adopted, which deals with a variety of conventional weapons, what are called conventional weapons. For example, light weapons, armoured combat vehicles, and even warships. The idea behind this treaty is not to ban the weapon per se, but rather to limit the transfer of such weapons. Therefore, the objective of the treaty is to establish global standards for national regulation of the transfer of conventional arms. For example, the treaty prohibits the transfer of such weapons where the state has knowledge that they would be used in the commission of genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes. And there are matters that a state has to consider when authorising the export of such weapons. For example, would it be used to facilitate the serious violation of international humanitarian law or human rights law? Now, all of this brings us back to the main point of weapons regulation. From its very earliest stages, international humanitarian law has prohibited certain types of weapons, either because of their indiscriminate effect on combatants and civilians, or because of the unnecessary suffering they have caused to combatants. Through a combination of arms control treaties, provisions in the law of armed conflict, we have seen a detailed regime covering weapons which fall within the description of weapons going back to 1899, 1907, that would cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. The function of the Red Cross that Chris has already mentioned in ameliorating the suffering of victims of armed conflict, including through its involvement in the diplomatic conferences which led to the conclusion of important treaties dealing with whole classes of weapons, is obviously crucial. The role of the Red Cross is recognised in this very well-travelled pocketbook, and we are commemorating that role 100 years later at this summit. So 100 happy years to the Australian branch of this great society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alison. Just for those guests that have just joined us, there are a few seats at the front and I think a few more by the sides. If you'd like to take a seat, feel free. So our next speaker is probably familiar to a number of people as well. Associate Professor Tilman Ruff, International Medical Advisor to Australian Red Cross. He's also the Associate Professor of the Nosal Institute for Global Health at University of Melbourne. Tilman has been Australian Red Cross International Medical Advisor since 1996. He is also Associate Professor, Nosal Institute of Global Health, University of Melbourne, a co-president of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, a Nobel Peace Prize 1985, and was founding chair of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. An infectious diseases and a public health physician, in 2012, Tilman was appointed a member of the Order of Australia for service to the promotion of peace as an advocate for the abolition of nuclear weapons and to public health through the promotion of immunisation programs in the Southeast Asia Pacific region. Please join me in welcoming Tilman.
Thank you, Chris, for that long and somewhat embarrassing introduction, but it's a terrific honour to be here, and thank you, Phoebe and Red Cross. It's a pretty happy birthday to be at. I'm really honoured to be here. In relation to nuclear weapons, I think it's very clear that what needs to be done is to address the weapons themselves rather than just their use, and I see them very much as the unfinished business of the biggest sort of global pathogen, if you like, the common threat. And for me, smallpox, the only infectious disease that's been eradicated, is a really useful analogy to what nuclear weapons are and what needs to happen to them. For me, in terms of a historical perspective, a really important threshold was crossed at the end of the First World War, but more particularly in the Second World War, with the widespread use of indiscriminate bombing of cities, civilians, but particularly cities. That was done by many sides to that conflict that turned flourishing cities through raging firestorms essentially into into massive crematoria that affected many countries. And in Japan even, the campaign of air bombing in Tokyo alone in one night killed more people than in the Hiroshima bomb itself. So burning cities, indiscriminate bombing, I think, if you like, is the moral political threshold that had been crossed that really enabled the use of the most efficient such incendiary weapon. The Red Cross was on the ground in Hiroshima before any other international agency, and the response to humanitarian disasters is the particular role that Red Cross has an unsurpassed global mandate for. And it's clear that in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the capacity to respond, the health infrastructure, the people, were very disproportionately decimated. Over 90% of the hospitals in Hiroshima were non-functional. Most of the physicians and nurses, over 90% of them, were killed or seriously injured. Most people had combined injuries, very difficult to treat even in optimal circumstances. And Marcel Junot, the Red ICRC delegate in Tokyo at the time, who visited Hiroshima shortly after the bombing, still makes chilling and salutary reading at just the horror of this as then unknown weapon with its late effects that caught up with people days or weeks after they had apparently recovered the immediate destruction, and absolutely overwhelming humanitarian needs that were essentially impossible to meet effectively, but he did an extraordinary job in trying to do so. And of course, the unique feature of nuclear weapons, the ionising radiation that causes increased long-term cancer and non-cancer health risks for the lifetime of those exposed and indeed for subsequent generations. And it's this aspect that I think is worth highlighting in particular. It's not that there's a very large amount of energy in ionising radiation. It's because it's particularly biologically damaging. So a lethal dose of radiation for a human being can contain no more energy than the heat in 3 mils of hot coffee that you just had at the end of your lunch. It's not a lot of energy. It's packaged in ways that are particularly biologically damaging. And of course, this reflects a large part of the indiscriminate, ongoing, transgenerational, transboundary aspect of the harm that nuclear weapons cause. Just in terms of the numbers, we still have something over 16,000 of them, a significant reduction from their peak, but unfortunately not a proportional destruction in destructive capacity. The largest nuclear weapons deployed are still 5 million tonnes of high explosive equivalent. They're on large Chinese long-range missiles. The bomb that destroyed the city of Hiroshima, by today's standards, would essentially be a relatively modest-sized tactical nuclear weapon. And even with that significantly reduced arsenal from its peak, if you dropped a Hiroshima-sized bomb every 2 hours since 1945, you wouldn't have finished yet to use up the current arsenal. The magnitude and the redundant capacity of destruction in that arsenal remains breathtaking. One of the complex issues related to nuclear weapons is that the material to produce them, the highly enriched uranium and plutonium that can be used to make weapons, are widely dispersed both in military and in civilian facilities. And there are vast quantities. You only need a couple of kilograms of plutonium or about 3 times as many kilograms of, 10 or so kilograms or less of highly enriched uranium to make a nuclear weapon. We have almost 1,400 tonnes of highly enriched uranium and almost 500 tonnes of plutonium, probably over 100,000 nuclear weapons worth of material in civilian and military stockpiles. So ending the production and very much securing the remaining stockpiles of these materials will be crucial to achieving and sustaining progress on nuclear weapons elimination. And this has been unfinished business for the international community since the very first resolution, Resolution 1.1 of the General Assembly in January 1946, called for the elimination of atomic weapons. For all of the other treaties, that some of which Alison discussed in more detail, but for all of the other inhumane and indiscriminate weapons, and essentially we now have some kind of legal prohibition regime around all of them except for nuclear weapons. For all of them, it was the unacceptable humanitarian harm intrinsic to the weapons that was decisive in trumping the utility and military arguments to justify their deployment. And everything that you can say that's indiscriminate and horrible about those other kinds of weapons is really writ large with nuclear weapons, which really pose an existential threat, really on a scale and in an acuteness unlike any other challenge we face. Just to bring it home a little, this facility outside Alice Springs is acknowledged by all governments and has been for the last many decades as a high priority nuclear target if nuclear weapons are used. If, for example, China wanted to mount a nuclear attack on Australia, the only missiles it has that can reach Australia reliably from the Chinese mainland have 4 to 5 megaton warheads on them. If you put a 5 megaton warhead over the city, we're sitting at about where that red arrow comes down now, we would be talking about a fireball hotter than the interior of the sun, 100 million degrees Celsius, 1.8 kilometres across. We would all be vaporised instantly. The concrete that this building is constructed from would explode and the very surface of the earth would be vaporised. And out to Wantirna, Springvale, Warrandyte, North Epping, Sydenham, Greenvale and Point Cook, the city would burn at 800 degrees Celsius. All oxygen would be consumed and nobody would survive. So the magnitude of what these weapons can do is really hard to grasp and confront. And the impossibility of any meaningful response has been a particularly important contribution that the Red Cross movement is making to promote that understanding. This is from an official multi-agency US government study looking at the likely consequence of a smaller than Hiroshima-sized bomb on the city of Washington. The numbers of casualties expected on the left there in the hundreds of thousands to millions, the response capacity in terms of intensive care and burn and indeed hospital beds in the region or the country short, even in normal circumstances, by factors of thousands. So the Red Cross contribution from ICRC President Peter Maurer at the Oslo conference, the first ever intergovernmental conference to address the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons 68 years after their first use, really was very clear that the humanitarian capacity globally is not now capable, nor would it indeed ever be capable of responding effectively to the aftermath of any use of nuclear weapons. And this reinforces conclusions that the World Health Organization and other major health agencies have made that essentially no health service in the world could deal with the consequences of even a single nuclear weapon on a city. And the World Health Organization, in reviewing those reports, clearly identified nuclear weapons as the greatest immediate threat to health and welfare. Even if the weapons aren't used, they exact a very major toll in health and in long-term environmental consequences. The radioactive and toxic pollution caused by the vast industrial infrastructure that has produced and developed and tested these weapons is the biggest industrial pollution cleanup issue that we face. These leaking underground tanks at the Hanford site where the plutonium for the Nagasaki bomb was produced are one very well-known example. But even we did a study some years ago looking at the consequences of the radiation exposure following on the atmospheric nuclear weapons testing program that happened up until the 1970s, and estimated at least 2.5 million excess cancer deaths globally just from the atmospheric fallout from nuclear weapons tests. And in Australia, fallout from the British nuclear tests in Australia in the 1950s contaminated, depending on where you lived at the time, or just about every part of the continent at different times, depending on which way the wind was blowing. 20,000, mainly young men, worked on this program with significant increases in cancer incidence and mortality. Subsequently, this is the logo for the Australian Nuclear Veterans Association, not an inappropriate choice of mascot there. And there are residual cleanup, contamination, compensation and care issues that will be with us for a very long time. The area from the minor trials which dispersed plutonium and uranium in the South Australian desert, the hard-fought British-Australian combined government clean-up cleaned up that little black triangular area right in the centre there. 98% of that contaminated area remains contaminated with plutonium fragments and can't be used for habitation. ICANN recently put together a small booklet on the legacy of nuclear testing in Australia, and I think it's an important reminder that brings this issue home. And I'm very pleased to say that Sue Coleman Hasseldine, an Indigenous woman who was born near Maralinga, is an invited guest of the Austrian government to give her testimony at the upcoming Vienna conference in a couple of weeks. That's the third conference now in that was kicked off in Oslo last year. So an Australian Indigenous woman voice in that setting, I think, is a terrific achievement. All of the nuclear weapon states are obliged legally to disarm their weapons. They made such an undertaking in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty ratified 44 years ago. However, if you follow the money, they're all massively investing in modernisation of their nuclear weapons and essentially look set to keep them indefinitely. It's estimated that just in the US over the next 30 years, the forward estimates are that over $1 trillion will be invested in renewing the factories that produce the weapons and maintaining the weapons. And this is true in all of the nuclear-armed states. It was estimated a number of years ago by some very distinguished economists and the World Bank that if about half that sum were added to overseas development assistance, the Millennium Development Goals could have been achieved with extraordinary humanitarian gains compared with the very conservatively estimated roughly $105 billion that the world spends on nuclear weapons every year. So any use would be terrible and we couldn't do very much. Even if we don't use them, they've cost us and continue to cost us a lot. Is there a likelihood that they might be used? And there are some very interesting recent data that suggests that this risk, if anything, may be increasing. There are still about 1,800 nuclear weapons on so-called high hair trigger alert or a high alert status, where essentially the military policy is that on perception of launch of an attack, they need to be used, otherwise they'll be destroyed by incoming missiles before they can be launched. So the decision times involved are really tight. And this is obviously highly prone to quick judgments, to technical errors, to false alarms and alerts. And there have been many of these, and even for those that happened a long time ago, there is a whole lot more information that clearly shows there have been many instances where deliberately or accidentally we've been very close. And it's really only been by luck that nuclear weapons haven't been used. And the most recent example after the end of the Cold War was a Norwegian weather rocket that was launched that looked in the satellite signature could have been a Trident missile. Its launch was notified to Russian authorities but wasn't effectively communicated. So for the first time, the President, Yeltsin at the time, a man with known serious substance abuse issues, probably drunk at the time if he was rousable, at 2 a.m. in the morning, had 4 minutes to decide whether to respond as the doctrine would have dictated with nuclear weapons launch. Thankfully, he didn't do that. But there have been many such accidents, and a couple of recent reports really highlight just how frequent those have been. And cyber warfare is an increasingly concerning dimension to this accidental risk of nuclear weapons use. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists Board of Sponsors has 18 Nobel laureates on it, and they are the custodians of the doomsday clock, which measures sort of how close we are to global catastrophe. And in recent years, they've left the hands of the clock essentially at 5 minutes to midnight, saying in successive years that leadership is failing. Stasis they talked about in 2013, and early this year they talked about really no significant sign of progress. So the risk of the weapons being used is clearly real. The most important new data that I'll just finish with is I think I'd really commend to your attention because I think for me it really makes the case absolutely overwhelmingly that even the relatively smaller nuclear arsenals pose a global threat, and that really the elimination of these weapons is the only sustainable path. And this relates to the climate impacts of even a relatively modest regional use of nuclear weapons. If nuclear weapons are targeted on cities, the fuel density of modern cities, all of the petroleum, oil, plastics, paper, flammable material, would release many times more energy than the explosive yield of the weapons themselves. And it's been known for a number of years through collaborative international scientific studies that even, this is work from the early 80s, showing that even 100 nuclear weapons targeted on cities could very abruptly lower the global temperature and cause major starvation. But the recent work that Alan Robock and colleagues have done is looked at the example of what would happen if, say, India and Pakistan came to war involving nuclear weapons. They've been to war 3 times since independence. They shoot across that border most weeks. What would happen if they used about 50 Hiroshima-sized weapons apiece on each other's cities? And clearly there would be major acute effects from burns, blast and radiation. But my focus is really the climate effect. Very conservatively estimated, this would put about 5 million tonnes of smoke into the upper atmosphere. It would spread very rapidly and essentially cover most of the planet within a fortnight. And this is data from several different scientific studies, but essentially showing about 1.5 degrees drop in global temperature that doesn't return to baseline as long as these models were run, which is 25 years. And global rainfall also drops quite precipitously. But averages can hide extremes. And if you put this against the trend of global warming we've seen over the last century and a half, then this is climate change that's absolutely unprecedented in human history. And it would not be evenly distributed. It would be colder and drier in the important continental interiors that are the major grain-growing regions of the world. So 1.5 degrees global average, but 4 or 5 degrees in key grain-growing regions. Much shorter growing seasons, dramatically reduced rainfall, and especially in the South Asian monsoon region, which feeds about 1.5 billion people, and major increases in ultraviolet radiation. This is the scale of the WHO UV index, and in summer, this is for the northern summer, most of the northern hemisphere would have an increase in UV index of between 3 to 6. So this is from sort of better put some sunscreen on to you better not go outside. And it would also significantly affect agriculture, plants and animals. So cold, dry, dark, more UV. And some studies that even just look at those direct impacts without looking at the potential disruption to trade and agricultural inputs show very drastic declines persisting over many years in major grain crops, so far studied in the US and China. 890 million people are chronically malnourished now, and malnutrition contributes to about half of the childhood deaths that occur. We know that food prices are very vulnerable to even modest reductions in supply, and the world grain stores are between 60 and 80 days supply at any one time. We are not well placed for a multi-year substantial decline in production. And apart from those who are currently malnourished, there are more than 300 million people who live in countries depending for more than half of their food intake on imports. We know that famines have occurred in the past, even when food production has hardly declined at all, when the prices have gone up and food has become inaccessible. If you put all of those impacts together, then at a very conservative estimate, and there haven't been comprehensive global studies on this yet, but if you just look at those people who are already hungry and the effects in China, then a very significant fraction of the world's population would be at risk of starvation from a nuclear war involving less than 1% of the world's nuclear weapons, less than 0.1% of the explosive yield in the global arsenal. I'm just going to go to the last slide to say some things about Red Cross. So just in conclusion, every type of weapon that has been developed has been used. And nuclear weapons have been used before, and we now know that both deliberately, by deliberate policy and by accident, we've come very close to their use on many, many occasions. The idea that these sorts of instruments of destruction can be retained in perpetuity and not used is not very well founded in the evidence. All of the evidence would suggest that the risks of their use, as the number of players that have them or could acquire them and the number of means for accidental launch or deliberate launch, particularly through cyber technology, increases, is probably going up. I think getting rid of them is really a necessary, urgent and feasible precondition for sustaining progress on essentially everything else. We can't wait, we don't need to wait 100 years more to eradicate them. This issue is not under control, and the increased engagement of Red Cross, the whole movement in this over the last 4 years, has been a very decisive factor in what I think is the most promising time for progress on nuclear disarmament in my relatively long time working on this issue, and certainly since the end of the Cold War. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tillman. Our next speaker is Dr. Phoebe Winpope, Director of International Law and Movement Relations here in Australian Red Cross. Phoebe has 25 years' experience in the humanitarian sector and has worked in complex humanitarian emergencies and conflict zones throughout Africa, the Middle East and Europe. This field work includes being CARE International Representative in Iran and responding to the humanitarian impacts of the first Gulf War and leading CARE Australia's humanitarian response to the Somali famine. Phoebe has also established CARE's program in Bosnia-Herzegovina during the armed conflict and worked as part of the humanitarian response to the Rwandan genocide. Following this experience, Phoebe returned to Australia to undertake a PhD in international law, focusing on the role of the international community when confronting war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Most recently, Phoebe was a founding director of the Humanitarian Advisory Group, where her work focused on the protection of civilians in armed conflict, the use of information technology for the prevention of mass atrocity crimes, as well as researching policy development for businesses operating in fragile and conflict-affected states. Please welcome Phoebe.
Thanks very much, Chris. Red Cross friends, it's so nice to be here to have the opportunity to talk to you all today. I think we've had two amazing presentations giving us an overview of the last 100 years of weapons law development and of the perils of nuclear weapons. And being the third speaker on the third panel on the, nearly the third day of a long conference, I am aware that it is difficult to maintain your attention, but there are a few things that I want to say. So one is, has everyone folded their origami crane yet? You all received it in your package. We're expecting them on the desk before you're allowed to leave this afternoon. No, we're not here for an origami lesson, but what I thought I would do is talk about one of the things coming to the Red Cross as a new Red Crosser from the outside. I'm told outsiders are called clean skins, so there you are, that's what I am. For a little while longer. I'm not too sure how long that label stays. I thought I'd been here for 4 months, but then I realised that I said that I'd been with the Red Cross for 4 months for 2 months. So maybe after 6 months you're not a clean skin anymore, I'm not too sure. Anyway, but one of the things around I thought that I would do today is to talk about the work that we have been doing, that the Red Cross has been doing for the nuclear weapons campaign and towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. But I wanted to really ground that in our IHL program. And I'm sure there's a lot of new faces to me here, so I'm not talking only to the IHL team, which is wonderful. And I hope there's people from across the country who I've had quite a few questions from inside the Red Cross and also outside the Red Cross about why exactly are we campaigning around nuclear weapons? How does that work with the Red Cross and what we do and what we traditionally do? And it seems to me to be a perfect fit. And it's a perfect fit because when we started when the Red Cross started, when Henry Dunant went onto that battlefield in Solferino and saw the inhumanity and the suffering on the battlefield, and left that battlefield inspired to do something and create a humanitarian movement that would be concerned with the way armed conflict was fought and concerned with the suffering of people in armed conflict and their capacity to have some sort of protection and to provide some balance in armed conflict between humanity and military necessity. I think it begins to frame very much the work of the movement and particularly the work of the IHL program. So in the years since Henry Dunant started the Red Cross, we know that the ICRC are considered the guardians of international humanitarian law, as well they should be, and they have indeed worked over the last 150 years tirelessly to promote respect for the law and in situations of armed conflict to encourage compliance with the law and to encourage the development and the consistent development of the law. And if we think about the last, the narrative that Alison has given us in terms of the development of the law, and we discover that the new laws are born out of the human experience and the experience that we've had. So we had the first Geneva Convention for the wounded on the battlefield coming out of Henry Dunant's experience on that battlefield in Solferino. The second Geneva Convention in post the Russo-Japanese War, looking at the wounded and shipwrecked and protections for them. The third Geneva Convention after the First World War brought around a convention, a multilateral agreement for the protection of prisoners of war, and the fourth Geneva Convention after the experience of the Second World War, thinking about protection of civilians. And so it goes. We see the emergence of the human rights movement. We heard a little bit this morning from Gillian Triggs about the relationship between human rights and international humanitarian law, and definitely the extension of protections offered to people in IHL in the additional protocols is in large part due to the influence of the human rights movement. The landmines conventions, the Rome Statute that we haven't heard so much about today, but the involvement of the Red Cross's Helen Durham, our very own Helen Durham, and she's still ours, even though the ICRC thinks she's theirs, and Tim McCormack, and in all of these things we've participated, and these laws have come out of the human experience, even down to the Rome Statutes, following on from the ICTY and the ICTR, the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda. For me, working with the Red Cross is such an enormously exciting opportunity to really be able to promote and develop laws that can prevent things from happening. So when we think about this narrative over the last 100 years of laws developing because of the human experience of the impact of those laws, there's one human experience that we have had that the law hasn't managed to develop, and that is the experience of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I think that we should be working to develop the law in a way that prevents that experience from ever happening again. And let's not think that we have to experience things before we do anything about them. And so it seems to me very, very natural that the Red Cross is working in this space. Tillman referred to Marcel Junot, who is the international Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC delegate who first arrived in Hiroshima in 1945, and we saw some of his reflections up there. And he described later that what he saw was a site totally unlike anything he'd ever seen before. The centre of the city was a sort of a white patch, flattened and smooth like the palm of a hand. Nothing remained. The slightest trace of houses seemed to have disappeared. The white patch was about 2 kilometres in diameter. Around its edge was a red belt marking the area where houses had burned, extending quite a long way further, covering almost all the rest of the city. And we've heard from Tillman that this, in today's context, would be quite a small tactical weapon, not the types of weapons that we're really concerned about. The human suffering was in many ways without precedence. And since that time, the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement has consistently called for states to take all steps to reach an agreement on the prohibition of atomic weapons. Just like the UN, who raised the awareness of this issue in the early days after the Second World War, and in fact, the very first resolution adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1946 was to establish a commission to deal with problems related to the discovery of atomic energy. And the Red Cross has been there right from that very beginning. And for example, on the 5th of April 1950, made a public statement calling for states to take all steps to reach an agreement on the prohibition of atomic weapons, noting that such arms will not spare hospitals, prisoner of war camps and civilians. Their inevitable consequence is extermination, pure and simple. Their effects, immediate and lasting, prevent access to the wounded and their treatment. So across the board, I think it's really interesting when people say to me as a newcomer to the Red Cross and when I'm speaking to people outside the movement, oh, this isn't really our concern. How can this not be of concern to the humanitarian community, more broadly speaking? And I think that the longevity of the involvement and the concern of the Red Cross is testament to its commitment and its particular role in the development of the law in this area. The Red Cross has, in international conferences of the Red Cross movement in 1948, 52, 57, 69, 77 and 81 have all called for prohibition of nuclear weapons and all weapons of mass destruction. We became more active in this in April 2010 when the former president of the ICRC, Jacob Kellenberger, made a historic appeal to the Geneva Diplomatic Corps. And he noted at that time that the organisation's position, and this comes back to the discussion that Alison had around unnecessary suffering, it went beyond the legal reasons for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, that it went to the unspeakable suffering that they cause, the impossibility of controlling their effects, not only over space but also over time, that these aren't weapons that just happen now but that have these long-lasting effects that Tillman has painted for us with some devastating consequences. The risks are the escalation that they create and the threat they pose to the environment, to future generations and to the survival of humanity. Kellenberger said these were our concerns, our humanitarian concerns, and this is why we're involved in this work. So in 2011, I think we're probably all familiar with the first resolution that was passed on the work for the movement to work for the elimination of nuclear weapons, which had both that humanitarian perspective and the legal perspective. So it starts out by talking about and emphasising the incalculable human suffering that would occur. And then it goes on to say that the movement notes that it would be difficult to envisage how any use of nuclear weapons could be compatible with the rules of IHL, in particular the principles of distinction, precaution and proportionality. And the resolution goes on to appeal to states. It sets out the movement's position and it requires all the parties to the movement to engage activities to raise public awareness and specifically health professionals, scientists and decision makers regarding the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. So this resolution was, I think, the beginning of, contributed to the beginning of a new movement that was really focusing the attention of the international community on humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, shifted the debate around nuclear weapons away from security and the political implications or uses or needs for nuclear weapons to a much more humanitarian space. And it also said that because of these humanitarian consequences and because of the fact that these consequences go beyond borders, that it's not only an issue for the nuclear states to be concerned about, but it is an issue for everybody to be concerned about. In 2013, the resolution was followed by another, which had a specific implementation plan, laying out a whole lot of work that was to be done by national societies, by the Federation and also by the ICRC. And I think we're all aware that Australian Red Cross has really been leading the charge and has been enormously active in this campaign and enormously supportive of our national society colleagues from around the world, and we continue to work with them. The momentum, as I said, has been building. So the first intergovernmental conference on nuclear weapons was in 2012 in Oslo. The beginning of 2013 in Oslo, and the second was at the beginning of this year in Mexico. And there's the third intergovernmental conference is going to be held in Vienna in a couple of weeks' time, and we have a delegation going to that conference. The conference will be discussing not only the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons, maintaining the pressure on the international community around that humanitarian side, but also be looking at risk drivers for deliberate or inadvertent use, the challenges of the use of nuclear weapons and other events, and also continuing on with discussions about the law. Just to reiterate some of the risk factors that I know that Tillman spoke to, in the last 4 years, there's been 1,500 security incidents in the US Air Force alone. So when we think about the 9 nuclear weapons holding states, and we might think about which of those states might have more secure, more solid, security and safety precautions around their nuclear weapons, it's quite concerning that that's a situation. Russia and the US still have a lot of weapons on high alert. The Minutemen in the United States are trained to send off 50 missiles within a minute of being asked to start a nuclear launch. So if we just reflect on that for a minute and think about the consequences of even a small exchange, as Tillman said, between Pakistan and India, what that might actually look like. There have been on the news talks of these Minutemen violating codes, security checks, cheats on proficiency tests, that was in the news earlier this year. So I think that the issue around the risk of a nuclear incident is quite high. We've recently done a survey in the Australian public to have a look at what people are thinking, generally speaking, in Australia about this issue. And broadly speaking, there's enormous support, over 80% across the board, across all age groups, for supporting a ban on the use of nuclear weapons, and supporting that Australia should support a legally binding treaty to ban nuclear weapons. So there's an enormous amount of support for this in the community. Interestingly, and this is perhaps a little bit of perspective between Tillman having worked on this issue over many, many years and me being much newer to the nuclear campaign, I was quite alarmed that only 17% thought there was a high threat of nuclear risk, whereas Tillman was quite heartened and thought that was quite a large number of people. So overall, 43% of the Australian of the people that we surveyed saw either a high or medium risk of either an accidental explosion or an intentional use of a nuclear weapon. So less than 50%, but Tillman was quite heartened by that, so perhaps that's progress on what has gone before and testament to your long and determined commitment to see an end to the use of nuclear weapons. Very quickly going forwards, because I've had the dinger, the Vienna conference, they're expecting a really good turnout. At the last conference, there was 148 states attended. The United States have indicated that they are going to go to Vienna, which is the first of these humanitarian impacts conferences that they will have attended. In October, the New Zealand government put a statement before the First Committee at the United Nations. They did the same thing last year. Raising concerns for the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons and calling for these concerns to be taken into consideration in the deliberations in the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, which is happening next year. Last year they did a similar thing. They had 125 signatories to their statement, or co-signatories, and this year there was 155 co-signatories, which is a significant increase in the number of states who are involved. So I think that there is definitely a momentum that has been building around this issue, it's no small testimony, I think, to the work of the movement across the world and the commitment of the movement in an ongoing way to keep campaigning and keep this in the forefront of people's minds going forwards. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Phoebe. So we've now heard from all of our three speakers, and we'll have a bit of an opportunity for questions. I've got the mic here, but I just wanted to say thank you to all of our speakers for covering such a broad topic in such short time. Alison gave us a bit of a snapshot of 100 years in 20 minutes, and through doing that eloquently through the use of a very well-travelled pocketbook, and reminding us as well, noting some of the, I guess, the drivers behind some of these developments that we've seen in the past, and I guess reminding us that these drivers, we could draw on them in terms of drawing the passion and how we could go forward in terms of nuclear weapons. And of course, Tillman giving us the real detailed insight into what is actually, the horrendous environmental and humanitarian impacts spanning space and time, which, is the very sort of humanitarian aspect that we're bringing to this discussion at the moment, and the role of Red Cross in that. In particular, reminding the world as one of the world's largest humanitarian organisations that together we are actually saying that despite all of our resources, despite our long-standing and experience in responding to these humanitarian issues, that there simply is no adequate response to the use of nuclear weapons, intended or otherwise. And Phoebe, thank you for bringing together some of the work that we've recently done in the movement and where things are heading into the future. So if there's any questions, I've got the mic here, so I'll walk it down, and please feel free to direct your questions to any of our panellists.
Hi, Tara Goodman from the IHL program in Canberra. Tillman, I just wanted a definitional explanation, because in my reading around this area, I've come across the phrase that you use tactical nuclear weapons a lot, and I'm trying to understand what they are. Does that suggest that there are nuclear weapons that can be tactically used in conformity ever with principles of IHL? But what are tactical nuclear weapons?
The definition is largely around the size of the weapon, so typically weapons in the tens of kiloton high explosive equivalent. So Hiroshima and Nagasaki size bombs, and the strategic ones have been, bigger, hundreds of kilotons to megatons. And it's also been the distance. There's sometimes been quite precise definitions used about tactical weapons being used within 500 kilometres or so, and strategic weapons being longer range. But essentially a nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon. And it's interesting that the United States in particular has had some fairly advanced programs for the development of weapons that where the argument was that if they were burrowing into the ground sufficiently, targeted at hardened military targets underground, for example, then it would be feasible potentially for them to be used and their effects to be confined and for the radiation not to be released. And that was actually an argument that was part of the submissions that the nuclear armed states put to the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion, which didn't have the technical capacity to investigate whether those claims were accurate. Well, the US Congress actually mandated the US National Academy of Sciences to do a detailed study of this robust nuclear earth penetrator, as it was called. Could nuclear weapons be used in a way where the effects were contained? And their very clear scientific answer was no way, not possible. So I think that's a pretty definitive answer that there is no reliable technical way that the effects of a nuclear explosion can be contained.
I'd like to add to this brief paragraph. Tactical nuclear weapons, by definition, apart from size, are those weapons which are actually confined to a battlefront or a battlefield and are limited in scope. The strategic ones which we refer to, I'm sorry, would invite much larger targets, cities, and much huge area. Yes, of course, everything is to do with size, but it's how these weapons are also used. Thank you.
Jean Valianos from Tully. I feel that we should not only be asking for nuclear weapons to be banned, I think every type of weapon should be banned. The most inhumane act that a human being can do to another is kill that person. Why aren't we going about 100 steps further and saying let's ban all weapons? I know it's hard, but I think we should make a stand and say we do not want any more wars. If you can't use your words and your intellect to come to some solution, then we should not go down the path of killing people.
Thanks very much. I think that comes back to the point that I was making, that weapons control regulations are really humanitarian considerations are one part, but also strategic considerations are the other. And so any of these efforts to ban weapons are always a result of, a number of different facets, although humanitarian considerations are obviously in the forefront when we think about treaties such as the Landmines Convention or the Cluster Munitions Convention, for example. But that comes back to, I think, why, for example, the Arms Trade Treaty doesn't actually ban light weapons. It tries to deal with issues relating to their trade in situations where it could have severe humanitarian consequences. But I certainly take your point that, one step further would be to say, well, there's not just an arms trade treaty, there's a treaty which regulates the production of all types of weapons. But I suppose this comes back to the reality, the pragmatic considerations versus also the humanitarian considerations, which is something which I think international humanitarian law deals with as a whole, those pragmatic and also those humanitarian considerations. I don't know if David is
Could I just add something? For me, it's clearly reducing the costs and consequences of armed violence of all types is a highly desirable thing to do, and it's core business for Red Cross. For me, from a public health point of view, this is a kind of a triage issue. Nuclear weapons, if they're used, essentially could make everything else we do redundant and utterly irrelevant, tragically irrelevant, in the space of a few hours. There's an absolute imperative to prevent their use. That's the first priority. Once we've done that, then we're going to have a whole lot more time and space to deal with all of the other multiple challenges that we need to deal with. But that's the big, urgent, unfinished business. That's the elephant in the room.
Thank you. Oh, can stand. My name's Angela. I'm from Perth. I just have a question of, so the presumption that there's no question we should ban nuclear weapons, My question is, this could take a number of years to do and obviously be quite complex. Does the Red Cross have a role in looking at safe management, limiting imminent use or accidental use? I mean, how broad is this role in protecting society? Does that make sense? Look at you looking at me, Phoebe.
No. I think it makes perfect sense. And part of the role of Red Cross national societies around the world as auxiliary to the public authorities in the humanitarian field is to be prepared for accidents and disasters, whatever they might be.
I'm looking at the proposal of development of policy to propose to countries that have the weapons to seek agreement to at least limit how they're held or managed, or as an interim measure until such time as they're banned. So I guess that's more my question.
Okay, so I think the Red Cross national societies in different countries approach their governments and the discussions that they have around those sorts of policy issues very much on a sovereign independent basis, as the national societies are. So those national societies I know that are very active around, or those national societies in nuclear weapons states, for example, I know do have regular dialogue and discussion with their governments around a whole range of different kind of issues and concerns on the way towards the work that we're doing towards trying to get movement towards a prohibition and ultimate elimination. So those discussions do definitely happen, and they happen at different levels with different national societies and different governments.
So you don't see it as an Australian role to encourage other countries?
Well, we work with...
Representatives
Yeah.
of the international community, I was looking more at the international community trying to encourage that rather than just normal, individual societies.
Well, I think if you and we have copies back at our desk. If you have a look at the resolutions, part of the work to do is to calling on the movement and all the national societies and what have you to work with their governments in this area. So I would see that the role of Australian Red Cross is to support our national society brothers and sisters and to work with the Federation. And we do that in a whole range of different ways. So, for example, we're developing a network of focal points, national society focal points of some national societies that are more active than others in this work, right across the region. So Nigeria, for example, Malaysia, Trinidad and Tobago. So different national societies from different Fiji, from different parts of the world who are going to really take an active role in their region to provide information to governments, briefings to governments about the concerns, the what sort of action governments can take, briefings before they go to Vienna. So that there is a lot of work being done as a movement, but also between the national societies. And it's governments, different governments want different levels of engagement in this area as well.
Hi, Eve from the International Humanitarian Law Program. My question is probably mostly for Alison, although happy for other comments. We had an excellent, although somewhat depressing presentation from Professor Gillian Triggs this morning about Australia's fairly poor record in implementing human rights, international obligations into domestic law. And I was just interested if you had any comments on Australia's record of implementing weapons law treaties into domestic law. And I guess I'm thinking around things like the Cluster Munitions Convention, where it would appear that whilst we were very supportive of the concept, we were also very keen to ensure that our national interests in an interoperability perspective were taken into account. So I just wondered if you had any comments on the way in which Australia approaches its weapons treaties obligations.
Yeah, there's probably others in the audience who are better qualified than me to answer this question, and I'm looking at two in particular. But I actually think that Australia, I'll leave aside the Cluster Munitions Convention for the moment, has a fairly good record in implementation of international humanitarian law as a whole, but also arms control treaties, and also involvement in the development of those treaties. So I didn't hear Gillian's presentation this morning, but and I understand her perspective certainly in relation to human rights law, and that is that we've not been great in implementing our obligations under various human rights treaties. But I think that our record in terms of international humanitarian law is very good, and certainly when it comes to interoperability requirements, there's another level altogether. And so here we're talking about, for example, when Australia deploys with a country, for example, who has not signed the Landmines Treaty or has not signed another weapons control treaty. So how do we deal with that situation? And that's a sort of another layer or another issue that sort of arises for us, but also for other countries who are in multinational operations where some parties have signed some treaties, for example, the additional protocols of 1977, but others have not. But I don't know if anyone else in the audience wants to sort of deal particularly with that issue of the Cluster Munitions Convention. But I see that as sort of like a sort of another level of, on top of our international issues that arise. Anyone else want to?
David Harper, Victoria. It seems to me that there are two existential threats to humanity at the moment. One is climate change, the other the use of nuclear weapons. The Red Cross has available here a sheet setting out what it could do and plans to do to alleviate the effects of climate warming. It's obviously given some thought to that topic, and the plans seem to be reasonably well worked out. Has the Red Cross attempted to address what the Red Cross might do in the case of a nuclear war? I assume it hasn't, and I assume it couldn't, because there's nothing that could be done. Is that assumption correct?
Thanks for the question. It's a great question, and it's one that I have been exploring myself over the last 6 months. My understanding is that it varies. Again, it really varies from state to state. So in Australia, we have had some discussion with some emergency management committees in some states around whether there is any preparedness for a nuclear incident in Australia. And my understanding, although I wouldn't want to necessarily stand on the record, my understanding at the moment is that there isn't really very much preparedness or thought going into that sort of preparedness beyond the sort of hazmat kind of preparedness that we generally have. Tillman might have more of a view. So I think from internally in Australian Red Cross, it is something that we have thought of a lot. And I know that it's something that is of concern to the whole movement, and one of the reasons why we've become so active in this is because of a recognition that any sort of capacity to respond effectively to any form of nuclear accident or incident is not there.
Probably, so we've got time for one short question and one short answer.
Hi, my name is Hannah and I'm from Sydney. I'd like to ask the panel, any of you, if we can't solve the problem of any kind of weapons in the world, why don't we start looking at our own home, where we have reintroduced the shooters laws again, and we are shooting people in our own country. So if we can't fix it in our own country, how can we fix the world? Have you got any comments, please?
I wish that we could fix the whole world. I think that I might answer your question with not such a hugely short answer, but an answer nonetheless. In 1994, as we are probably all aware, the fastest genocide in history took place in Rwanda. And it took place not with any big weapons, it took place with knives, with machetes, with 4x4s. So I suppose my answer to your question is that people have the capacity to do terrible things to other people with whatever comes to hand. I think from our point of view, when we're trying to work within the scope of the work that we do in IHL, which is not so much about ending all wars, but by recognising that war does happen, so how can we possibly create any sort of space that has some human context within it. So the weapons that are used, how they're deployed, where they're deployed, against whom they're deployed, all become really critical questions. So, you know, I say to you, I would dream of a world of no wars and no weapons, but within the scope of the world that we have, if we can create some limitations around that context that does exist, then we're probably moving towards a better place. Does that, anyway.
Just a really quick comment. Just to reflect internationally, Australia, I think, has played quite a mixed role. I mean, in some respects, Australia has been a real international leader historically. I mean, that first meeting of the General Assembly was chaired by one Dr. H.V. Evatt. And, you know, Australia took the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty from the CD to the UN General Assembly. Australia played a major role in the Chemical Weapons Convention. Australia, unfortunately, because of its continuing claimed reliance on extended nuclear deterrence provided by the United States as the fundamental guarantor of Australia's security in every defence white paper since 1994, is not on the front foot in relation to nuclear disarmament. So it's a mixed picture, but I think we need to work on all fronts. Clearly, the promise that I see, that I perceive now with these international conferences and this whole taking ownership of this as a global issue, this is an issue that affects us all. This is an issue that can't be left to the states that possess the weapons alone. And we've seen spectacular progress in relatively quick order on landmines and cluster munitions, with a few small governments working together with international organisations and civil society, despite the opposition of the major users and producers, have come up with treaties that have had major effects. And the US now has agreed to abide by the provisions of the Ottawa Treaty, except in Korea, even though it's not a signatory to them. So I think the role of all of the rest of humanity, the 80% of governments that signed that last New Zealand statement, is where there's grounds for hope. They can't eliminate the weapons, but they can sure ban and stigmatise them. That will bring forward the elimination very much.
Thank you. So, unfortunately, that brings us to time for this session, and we are moving into afternoon tea. And if our speakers are around for afternoon tea, I'm sure they'd be happy to take any questions during that time. So, thank you all for your time today, and thank you to our panellists once more.